Here we have Anthony Tessi, who is Anthony Mitchell's grandfather. He was born on June 15th, 1937, and was part of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
He was enrolled in the Massachusetts National Guard in 1957 and was in the National Guard at the time of the crisis. He was about to be deployed if we had not reached an agreement.
So, how old were you at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis?
I was 26 years old. And at that time, we were called to report to the National Guard Armory in Fitchburg, and they called us on a Friday, said we had to be there Saturday and ready to leave Sunday to maybe to be sent to Fort Evans, and then from there to get involved with the crisis that was going on with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And at that time, when they called us up, the Russians were sending the final parts to the missiles to Cuba on their ships. And when we knew that, we put up a naval blockade around Cuba. And the Russian ships kept coming and coming and coming until they got about 50 miles within Cuba. And everybody in the world was trying to figure out what was going to happen when these two nations collided with their armaments. And the Russians finally, when they were, I think, within about 50 miles of Cuba, took their ships and turned them around and and the ships went back to Russia. So that ended the Cuban Missile Crisis as it got to the point where it looks like something bad was going to happen in the world, and we were going to have a missile fight between Russia and the United States, and a lot of people would be involved and killed and so forth. So at that time, while the United States was watching these ships coming to
Do you believe that it was the United States' responsibility to not only protect their own citizens, but save the entire world from a full-out nuclear war? And was it also important to keep the balance of power between these two superpowers, the U.S. and Russia?
Yes, because since the end of World War II, you must remember that the Soviet Union, or Russia, however you want to call them, and the United States and its allies were busy trying to keep the peace between the two by who's going to build this missile that's stronger than that one's got, and who's going to be able to build a nuclear missile and instead of an atomic bomb, a nuclear bomb to wipe out the other. So nobody wanted this to happen, but everybody had to keep building more bombs and more armament because the other person, Russia did it, we did it, and so the thing just got out of hand. There were too many missiles, and so from 1945, since World War II ended, until 1962, when the Cuban Missile Crisis came about, this was the high point of all these armaments, and somebody wanted to take over to be the #1 superpower. And this was what Russia was trying to do when they decided to put missiles in Cuba and aim them at the United States so they could wipe us out first before we could get them.
Do you believe that the United States had the right to blockade Cuba?
Definitely, because the United States, through the Constitution, has the liability of protecting its citizens from all sorts of dangers. And this was a very dangerous time in world history, and if we didn't move to stop this, the Russians would have been able to annihilate the United States, and we would have done the same thing to Russia. So the world would have been wholly involved. The Russians had intercontinental missiles placed in Russia that could reach the United States. We had missiles, intercontinental missiles in the United States that could reach Russia. We had missiles in Europe that could reach Russia. So it would have been an all-involved world, and I don't think there'd be much left of civilization on the planet.
What do you think would have happened if we had ended up going to war with the Soviets over Cuba?
Well, I don't think there'd be many people left in this world. Number one. And the reason I say that is the Russians on their soil had intercontinental missiles buried in the ground in tubes, as did the United States. But we also had missiles in Europe pointed at Russia. So the Russians wanted to have missiles in Cuba pointed to us so they could level off the playing field, so to speak. And if I'm sure if the Russians would have fired off missiles to the United States would have fired off, from Cuba. The United States would have had to fire missiles toward Cuba and toward Russia, and the missiles in Europe would have been fired toward Russia. So you would have had the whole world involved in this nuclear nightmare, and millions and millions of people would die as a result. Stage of their missiles to Cuba to direct them toward the United States. At that time, the United States put a naval blockade around Cuba, but the ships kept coming towards Cuba from Russia with all these parts that would put together the missiles and be ready to be fired. And as the Russian ships were approaching the naval blockade, don't forget, there's a big distance between Cuba and where these Russian ships were coming from, so it took quite a few days. The United States started calling up National Guard units, Army Reserve, and Naval Reserve to bolster their armed forces to prepare for a possible invasion of the Cuban island and wipe out Russian missiles, either by force or by air or by whatever. And at that time, I was called to the National Guard Armory in Fitchburg. I was a member of the 26th Yankee Division of the Massachusetts National Guard, and they called up the whole division, I believe. And we were called, our unit was called to the Fitchburg Armory to be there Friday night, and we were to get instructions to get prepared on Saturday to leave on Sunday to go to Fort Devens. And from Fort Devens, they didn't tell us any more than that, but we were going to get to Fort Devens and then be deployed south to Florida or one of those southern states to be part of the invasion force. And as it happened, as these ships kept coming closer to Cuba, everybody was worried that something terrible was going to happen. But when the ships got within 50 miles of Cuba, I think, you'd have to look up the history book to find out the exact mileage, but something like that, the Russians finally decided it wasn't worth it and turned their ships back and took the missile parts back to Russia. And so that happened so quickly that we never left the Army to be deployed.
Yeah.
And so Sunday morning we were sent home.
Came very close, though.
Right.